Okay, so Nikos has very helpfully described the rise of industrial civilization, but I want to talk about the fall, and thus the displacement of this grand quest onto the human subject. The trajectory of the Industrial Revolution was supposed to give us greater and greater human control over life. Whatever problems there were would no longer be relegated to the realm of fate, to be endured by the pious, but, as Nikos said, understood. And in that understanding, we would root them out. The only thing between us and a future utopia was time. Obstacle by obstacle, we would subject these problems to human reason and would finally get to that future. Industrial civilization, have I done something wrong? Oh, yeah. Industrial civilization would give us the material means to overcome problems that had once seemed natural. It would bring us a world of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But something went wrong. We are not yet there. So many people will tell you today that rights are illusory. We have formal equality, but are we really equal when it matters? If you go to court, people will say, really it's whoever has the most money that will win. We no longer seem to talk so much about the brotherhood of men, but about the unique experience of particular individuals. In fact, I'm sure if I said of men somewhere else, everyone would get a little bit upset and uncomfortable. Instead, we talk about folks. Ever hear that? You notice that? People have abandoned the word people, which is a very liberal Enlightenment word, people. And now they talk about folks, which is a very romantic, reactionary word, who will never understand each other and probably never quite get along. We've achieved great feats, but we still feel ourselves to be, like the ancient Greeks, living in a great civilization, yet still subject to the gods of fate. Ironically, we still have that rational engineering spirit, but we've turned it inward. We no longer dream so much of engineering great structures, but instead we seek to engineer the human psyche. In fact, I was just listening to Times Radio last night, and they had the Times Sunday bestseller list, and they had the 100 best-selling books of all time. And one of the commentators noticed that the further back you go, the more the books are about the world, history, something bigger than the individual. And the more you go toward the present, they're more about me, myself, and I. So we no longer dream so much of engineering great structures, but instead we seek to engineer the human psyche. 21st century planners no longer seek to centrally plan the human economy, but instead they seek to plan the human mind. How did this happen? In The Politics of Authenticity, Marshall Berman wrote that the Enlightenment philosophers were the first group of thinkers to see clearly the vast range of possibilities for human self-expression in the world. The very first lights of the modern industrialized world seemed to reveal possibilities that most human beings had previously ascribed only to the heavens. At the same time, these possibilities seemed unevenly realized, or altogether imaginary. And I think we're still grappling with this tension between the possibilities of the human subject and the reality of what can and can't be realized today. And I think there's a very good way of illustrating this. It's a very, very difficult subject because you kind of want to go through all of the Enlightenment and all. And it's a very, Frank said a few years ago in one of these speeches, people will talk about the Enlightenment project. He says there's not really a project. And it's very difficult to kind of pull out something coherent. But I think there's a very illustrative contrast that can be drawn between the French 17th century mathematician, philosopher, and defender of religion, Blaise Pascal, and the over-optimism of the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. And this contrast illustrates a persistent tension with which we are still grappling. So Pascal was profoundly pessimistic about the human condition. He saw life as an endless distraction from the inevitable void of death. Human beings, for Pascal, were inherently insincere, constantly deceiving themselves and others. The void, the emptiness of modern life, was not something that could ever be filled with human effort. When Pascal looked out into the world, he did not see endless possibilities for human self-realization that modernity appeared to promise. Instead, he writes, the activities men engaged in did not constitute an expression of the self, but rather a displacement and a disguise. Not a fulfillment, but an endless emptiness. Pascal thought that human beings were naturally infected with the vice of insincerity. Most of their lives and supposed fulfillments were simply illusions. The mutual deceit on which society was founded was simply the sum of all individual deceptions, he thought. Only when locked away from society, in an inert world of quiet contemplation, could man truly be himself. And yet still, he was not happy. I have discovered, Pascal concludes, that all of the unhappiness of men arises from a single fact, that they are unable to stay quietly in one room. Can we not see that now? Why is man so perpetually unsatisfied? Why can't he just be content to sit quietly in his room? But what Pascal failed to realize was that the emptiness man felt in the void, this is Marshall Berman, might reveal not the emptiness of his nature, but the unnaturalness of the void. In other words, the unease men feel in the void only evidence the futility of ever trying to find fulfillment inside your head alone. Now contrast this with Voltaire, an Enlightenment thinker who was much more optimistic about the potential of human beings. Voltaire believed that through reason and effort, human beings could improve themselves and society. While Pascal saw life as a series of distractions from the void, Voltaire saw human activity, whether in art, sciences, or politics, as a way to achieve self-fulfillment and improve the human condition. And so Voltaire sought to take the part of humanity against this sublime misanthrope, Pascal, retorting that man is fortunate that he attaches ennui to an action in order to force us to be useful to ourselves and to others. Voltaire contended that man's need for occupation and action is not a divertissement from himself, but rather his authentic self-fulfillment. Humanity realizes itself when it acts upon the world. However, if Pascal was too eager to reject the modern world and humanity's ability to fulfill itself within it, Voltaire was too quick to embrace the world as it was during his time. Even though Voltaire thought man proved himself by being occupied, he didn't seem enough perturbed by his own admission that most occupations of his time were so empty of meaning that it basically did not matter what men did. And this is where I would disagree a little bit with Nikos, that you said that the industrial society had the most complete human beings, but that wasn't the reality. I remember this image of a woman during the Industrial Revolution making matchsticks for 18 hours a day, covered in dirt, and there's a baby sleeping on the floor. It's not the most complete human being. And most people saw this and were perturbed by it. This wasn't the promise and hope that they saw in the Industrial Revolution. This was the reality. And we had to reckon with it. Look at all this possibility and look at the reality. While Voltaire's views softened over time, he possessed and never fully shed a distrust in the masses, identifying them with passion and the educated class with reason. But nonetheless, this tension between the pessimism of Pascal and the highly selective optimism of Voltaire is a representative anecdote that well illustrates the forces that our society is still grappling with today. If the world fails to live up to its ideals, do we abandon those ideals? Or the world? Or both? Do we seek refuge in a world of quiet contemplation? Just give up on it. Find happiness within. All of that stuff is just stuff. Do we explain humanity's persistent failures and problems as things that arise out of humanity itself? Or can we, see humanity as providing the solution? Neither of these thinkers nor their society since that time have succeeded in fully recognizing, much less resolving, these conflicts. Marshall Berman continues, just as much as Pascal was dismayed by modernity, Enlightenment philosophers, elated by the beauty and grandeur of their vision, lost sight of the great gap between what they saw and where they stood, between what was possible for man and what was real for men, between the human world as it might be and European society as it was. Why have we not been able to bridge that gap that separates the idealization of the subject, that possibility that this could be the most complete human beings, that we had that possibility of time, that the industrial society gave us, and we couldn't fully realize it. Dimly perceiving this gap but unable to reckon with it, Pascal tossed humanity into the abyss. We live in that void between the present and the future, and we've not been able to bridge it. And Pascal says, the void is in you. It's in your head. Learn to live with it. Embrace the world. It's just the way things are, just the way man is, and the difficulty is learning to live within it. Voltaire built a bridge that only some could cross. It seems now that we are tending to back towards that abyss, rather than trying to build a sturdier bridge, both figuratively and in the real world. Another contrast might be useful here between Condorcet and Malthus, but if you've ever heard me speak before, you will have heard me say it. But essentially, where Condorcet saw human history as a series of epochs progressively moving toward a future of greater enlightenment, where for human beings even death will become optional, Malthus retorted, this is Condorcet writing in, 1796, as he's literally being hunted down during the Terror. And he writes one of the most optimistic books ever. He sees all human history is progressing. And every problem that we have, we're going to figure it out. We're going to understand the world, and we will get to this 10th epoch where he imagines the human life will know of no upper limit. The human lifespan will know of no upper limit. We won't even die anymore. And then Malthus responds, and he writes the essay on the principle of population in response to Condorcet and William Godwin. And he says, he's very disparaging. And he says, no, these twin forces of sex and death will just cancel each other out, and it's just misery forever, and ever it shall be. Get used to it. Live with it. And the point is that where some people saw the potential of modern industrial society for greater freedom, others saw it as a distraction from what really mattered. And what really mattered was within. And the problem was learning to just be happy with that. And in addition, what industrial society did is it fed man's hubris. We thought we could become gods. Well, look what happened instead. The tragedies of the 20th century finally shattered that dream of a society ruled and driven by human reason. We had the horrors of world wars, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and the failure of centrally planned economies. And all this led to a profound disillusionment with the vision of the human hand on history, consciously directing it toward its will. The most optimistic visions of this quest, I think represented by a figure like Karl Marx, who thought that we would one day be able to understand even the forces of the economy and direct them to our conscious ends, who foresaw a world in which we would no longer be separated from our will by the impersonal forces of the market, but able to consciously direct them. A world that would finally see human history begin. All of these dreams were shattered by what actually happened when humanity tried to do it, tried to direct the forces of history. It seemed doing so would only bring us to ruin. And so the idea that we could centrally plan the economy was, of course, abandoned. But it was abandoned in a very peculiar way. Instead of planning the economy, our society seeks more and more to centrally plan the human mind. This is the shift of liberal dreams of man controlling the world to a post-liberal dream of controlling man. We live in deeply post-liberal times, and this post-liberal pessimism transcends political divides. The 20th century took this pessimism and systemized it into the form of what people often call neoliberalism. But neoliberalism is a misnomer. It would be more accurate to call it post-liberalism. And in fact, many of the neoliberals were very clearly critics of the Enlightenment. People think of neoliberalism as simply a rollback of the state and it's laissez-faire. But as the editors of the 9 Lives of Neoliberalism have pointed out, it's anything but a market fundamentalism, which purportedly dictated the liberal markets and the transformation of every member of the world's population into Homo economicus. Actually, what neoliberalism has evolved into over nearly a century of its articulation and practice is a strong state, which develops around an internally robust, yet externally fragile market, which protects it and seeks the rollout of a new form of state to match a rollback of another kind of state. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with this thesis. This is Philip Murawski, or this idea of like the market is this grand computer, this wonderful computing device, and human beings are, this is his description of neoliberalism and neoliberal thinking, and human beings are just too shit for it. Like we mess it up, you know, so that's what I mean when I say it's internally fragile, internally robust, but externally fragile. So they almost, if you listen to some neoliberals talk, they almost sound like leftists or something, because it sounds like a critique of capitalism, but it's not. It's a critique of you. It's a critique of you. The market's too good for you. The form of the state that rolls out is intensely interested in the psychology of individuals. Many people have been fooled into thinking that behavioral economics, for example, represents a questioning of mainstream economics, or even of neoliberalism, understood as laissez-faire. But it is the epitome of the post-liberal certainty that yes, the economy doesn't work, but it doesn't work because of a problem in humanity, because of the things that are bubbling just below the surface. The left thinks it's saying something quite profound when it questions Homo economicus. Real human beings aren't like that, they say. They think that they are somehow wounding economics or even capitalism. But what kind of powerful liberal critique says of capitalism, the problem is that human beings are too stupid for it? And anyway, Hayek himself described the accusation that economists required an economic man that was better than he was as a straw man criticism, as he wrote in Individualism and Economic Order. It would scarcely be too much to claim that the main merit of individualism, which he and his contemporaries have advocated, he's talking about Adam Smith, is that it is a system under which bad men can do least harm. It is a social system which does not depend for its functioning on our finding good men for running it, or on all men becoming better than they now are, but which makes use of men in all their given variety and complexity, sometimes good and sometimes bad, sometimes intelligent and more often stupid. Neoliberals are not defenders of Enlightenment values. They are critics. The left's critique of Homo economicus is in unison with the neoliberals, not against it, and not against them. And more they take it as given that humans are irrational, flawed, and that these flaws must be carefully controlled, lest society and the fragile economy be driven to ruin. So no one really likes its own, I mean, obviously this is a huge and varied kind of outlook that I'm talking about here, but there's a tendency to kind of disparage capitalism. Yeah, it's a really bad system and so on, but as I said, the problem is you. It doesn't work. It never tends toward equilibrium in reality, but you have to kind of very carefully control everything around it to control this tendency toward ruin. So the rejection of economic planning doesn't lead to a laissez-faire attitude. Instead, neoliberals argue that since humans cannot be trusted to make rational decisions on their own, their behavior must be carefully managed and controlled. In other words, while we no longer hope to engineer great structures, we do aim to engineer the human psyche. Neoliberalism sees the flaws in human beings, not the system, as the root of social problems. Therefore, the solution is not to change the system, but to change people. This is why we see such a strong emphasis on psychological and emotion management in contemporary society. Whether it's mindfulness training, cognitive behavioral therapy, promotion of resilience, the focus is always on the individual's internal state rather than the external conditions that might be causing a problem. Development comes to be conceived more and more as human development. The Enlightenment privileging of autonomy is replaced by a fierce fear of autonomous choice-making. People are flawed. They make the wrong decisions. They simply will not do what they should do. They will not say what they must say. They will not choose the way they must. We have to accept that and encourage people to see their autonomy not as a good thing, but as a risk to themselves and others. This is why I find it very annoying if you work in the area that I do, which is sort of like therapy culture, global therapeutic cultures, this kind of thing, this critique of the permeation of psychology into everything. People will often say, it's an attempt to engineer the ideal neoliberal subject. And when they say neoliberal, they're not talking about it like I'm talking about it. They talk about it like it's just a rehashing or rejuvenation of liberalism, of economic liberalism. But it's not. It's the destruction of those things. That is why it is post-liberal. It is not an attempt, this like mindfulness and resilience and human development and capabilities. All of this stuff is not an attempt to engineer an autonomous subject. It's an attempt to engineer a subject that learns to doubt its autonomy, that learns to always constantly look for someone better, some expert that will solve their information weakness, that will help them to choose correctly. As a good citizen in this society, the society that no longer believes in humanity, you must learn to doubt your free will. The void that we have been unable to bridge, the gap between what is and what ought to be, is now being filled by throwing humanity down into it. Yes, there are problems, but the problem is internal to us. It's psychological. The failures of society are no longer seen so much as systematic. To the extent that they are, they're the problems of internal systems to the individual. So to conclude, the history of industrial civilization is not just a story of technological progress and material abundance. It's also a story of a profound shift in how we understand the human subject. The optimism of the Enlightenment has given way to a deep pessimism about human nature. And this pessimism has been systematized in our post-liberal political, social, and developmental formations, which seek more and more to control and manage the human and the human mind rather than the external world. We do need a new industrial revolution, but we can never have this if we don't believe in the ability of human beings to imagine, create, and oversee it. We live, as I said, in a gap between the past and the future, what is and what could be. We are steeped in ideologies that beg us to stay in our rooms, to embrace the void, to meditate and beautify your void. Make it your own. And the powers that be are increasingly frustrated by our inability to be satisfied in the void. Nico said that there isn't a demand for another industrial revolution. I actually think that there is. I think people do expect that the future will be better than today. I think the Industrial Revolution opened the genie is out of the bottle, basically, and you can't shove it back in. People know what is possible, and they're constantly being told, you can't have it. If we continue to create, if we continue to develop industrially, we will destroy the world. You must learn to be content with what is. You must learn to stay in your room. Here's a guided meditation. And that's not good enough. We are no longer building bridges to the future, we are building prisons for the human psyche. And until we realize this shift and its implications, we will continue to mistake the symptoms for the disease and throw humanity down into a void we've created. We need to learn how to build bridges, both figuratively and in the real world. So, thank you.